Today is an opportunity for us to stop and look in the mirror, to look at ourselves. When's the last time you did that in your life figuratively? When you looked at yourself to see, what am I good at? What are you good at? What ways could you improve? What are those outside factors that are helpful and are they contributing to your growth? And what are those outside factors, relationships, situations in which you find yourself that aren't so good and that are keeping you down? Maybe even that are toxic. In the business world, they have what they call SWOT analyses. A SWOT analysis, I don't know if you've heard of that, a SWOT analysis. SWOT is an acronym meaning looking at your strengths, but also looking at your weaknesses. SWOT, strengths and weaknesses. And the O and the T are for opportunities and threats. Opportunities and threats. So I was thinking that today what we would do is, in the same way that we as individuals look at our own strengths and weaknesses, if we were honest with ourselves, why don't we today look at the strengths and the weaknesses of the independent Catholic movement, but also the opportunities and the threats. So the question is, what's the difference between strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats? If you were to create a quadrant here, if you were to have 4 boxes, where one row is for the good things and one row is for the bad things, and one column is for the things that are internal, things that you can control, and things that are external, things that we can't control, then that's how we would divide the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. The strengths are internal. It's something that I can control. If I'm strong at something, it's probably because I've developed that gift. And if I'm weak at something, that probably means that I could develop in that way. If I were a teacher, to use that example, right? I might be strong in certain things and weak in other things, right? Strong in teaching multiplication tables, a little weaker in classroom management or time management, right? Those strengths and weaknesses, things that I can control, things that I can grow in. What is the opportunities and threats? Those are all outside of us. So outside of my being a teacher, there are things that impact me. Opportunities are the good things. Threats, the not so good things. An opportunity, if I have a good principal who supports me, that would be an opportunity that I have. A threat, if I have a principal or coworkers who are trying to sabotage me and keep me down. Those are things that I can't control. What they do, it's outside of my control. So when businesses talk about a SWOT analysis, they look internal, they look external, they look at the good things, the bad things, to try to assess who they are and where they're at. So what I thought we'd try today is a SWOT analysis. Let's take a look at the strengths and the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats of the independent Catholic movement, which, as we heard yesterday, is part of a larger movement of the independent sacramental movement. So today let's concentrate on independent Catholicism, and let's look at the mirror at ourselves, and let's be honest about our strengths, but more importantly, our weaknesses. Let's talk about the opportunities that we have, but also let's talk about those things that threaten us. What I propose is we're going to do them in reverse order, and we're going to talk first about weaknesses. And the reason that I thought we would do this is because if there are weaknesses in the independent Catholic movement, this is going to reflect on us. If some independent Catholic priest or bishop or deacon or seminarian says something anywhere in the United States, and then they come to someone comes to Holy Family with that experience, it's going to reflect on us. Oh, I knew an independent Catholic priest once. Oh yeah, I once knew an independent Catholic bishop. Follow me? How it is that it reflects on us. So the question becomes, how do we take a look at this and assess this? So should we start first with our weaknesses, and then our strengths, and then we'll come back to threats and opportunities. First, weaknesses. If we were to look at the independent Catholic movement, remember that here at Holy Family, and at the missions that we have here at Holy Family, we're part of the American Catholic Church in the United States, which is part of this larger movement of independent Catholicism. How are we weak in independent Catholicism? I've come up with a few ideas. One, formation. The Roman Catholic Church, think about this for a moment. This was interesting. When Father Lawman was talking about another large community in the United States, in St. Louis, Missouri, by Father Merrick, when we started thinking about what it is that we have in common, the three of us were formerly Roman Catholic priests. So there's something to be said about three of us coming with more theological formation, more seminary experience. For most priests, they've been in the seminary system for like 10 years, full time. Like they lived in the seminary. So we have to acknowledge one weakness, one challenge that we have in the independent Catholic movement is we don't have the same seminary system where people go and they live and they pray together and they study together. For the most part, we are working clergy in the independent Catholic movement, which means that many of us have our families and we have our jobs. And it's not as if we can just go and escape and live in a seminary somewhere and live and pray and build community and study with other people. So it seems that a professor of management once told us as a class, he said, always remember when it comes to other people, they're doing the best that they can with what they have. There's no doubt in my mind that that is true of the independent Catholic movement. Any deacon, priest, bishop is doing the best that he or she can with what he or she has. Just imagine if we in the independent Catholic movement had the same formation to be able to draw from, if we had the same time. Think about that for a moment, the time that they dedicate to research and to writing and to studies. Imagine if we had that in the independent Catholic movement. It seems that one weakness, if we were to be honest, is the lack of formation that we have as a movement. These are things that I think about. It's one of the reasons that we had a theological institute for 3 years in our parish, simply to be able to concentrate on how do we help to deepen that experience. Because after all, how can we do things that we don't know if we don't know how to do them, right? If I'm a priest, how can I celebrate the sacraments if I've never been taught to celebrate the sacraments? How can I celebrate Mass unless I'm stumbling through it or something, unless someone has actually sat down with me and tried to teach me these things, right? The bishop, being a bishop, comes with various functions, right, of teaching, right? How can I teach if I don't have that well from which to draw? So it seems that for all of us, proclaiming the word, deacons, I think of deacons, even deacons proclaim the word and preach, right? So unless someone works with us on those skills, it's just us coming to it with the experiences that we have and the knowledge that we have. So it just seems that we would do well in independent Catholicism to think deeply on this and maybe even to insist on better formation. The challenge being that Archbishop Bill, and it's his prerogative, he could lay hands on anyone today. He could consecrate anyone a bishop in this room right now. He could ordain anyone in this room, a deacon or a priest right now. But does that serve independent Catholicism for us to do those sorts of things without that person having a certain formation upon which they can build in their ministry? Another weakness of the independent Catholic movement, a lack of unity. The Roman Catholic Church is 1 billion strong, and all of them are organized in a system, right? Good, bad, or otherwise, they are organized into a system. In independent Catholicism, we often don't have that beyond the local level. We organize ourselves locally and maybe into a jurisdiction, but it's a good thing, there are no multiple layers, but at the same time, that means that there's very little unity. What unity do we here in Austin have with other independent Catholic communities? What unity do they have with one another? In far too many places, it's individuals doing their thing, performing their ministry in their own way, but without this connection to others. We all see the weakness in that. How can we learn and how can we grow as much as we could be otherwise if we're not somehow sharing our experiences and in communion with others? This lack of unity, it seems that there are at least 3 reasons for this lack of unity. One of them is the differences between us. Let's just be honest. Among Catholic clergy, there are real differences that exist. Some of the differences are based on how wide our circle is. Some communities are more inclusive, and for instance will allow for the possibility of women to exercise ministry in a way. Other independent Catholic communities, let's just be honest, don't widen their circle so much. So I think the question is, how wide is your circle? And where is your circle? In terms of history, where is we have all these communities, and they're like coming from different time periods, if you will. If you look on social media, you'll see photos of people wearing vestments that are very strange to us here at Holy Family, because, for instance, they're celebrating the Tridentine Mass. They're celebrating what? The Latin Mass, with the vestments that we used to use for the Latin Mass before the 1960s. Okay? That's one time period, one vision of the church. Is that our vision of the church? And what does that mean for unity? How simple would it be for us to be in communion with persons who are celebrating the Masses in different ways, in different languages, dressed in different ways? We would just have to ask ourselves that question. I mean, ideally, we're all part of the independent Catholic movement, but if we were honest, there are probably different buckets within that circle of people who celebrate Mass and the sacraments and who do ministry in different ways. Social justice. I'm imagining that different circles within independent Catholicism are going to have different views towards social justice. We heard Father Lawman yesterday say that his community tithes for social justice, social ministry, we call it. You know, there are going to be other communities that are less interested, less focused outside of themselves, more focused on whatever it is that they're doing, trying to grow and support their own ministries. Another reason for the lack of unity, it seems, is individualism. Think about this one for a moment. A sociologist, Geert Hofstede, said that you can take all the cultures of the world, and there are 5 factors that distinguish cultures from one another. And one of those 5 factors is individualism versus collectivism. How individual are you, and or how collectivist are you? In independent Catholicism, I'd like to suggest that too often we are individualists. Instead of thinking about us, we think about me and my community. It becomes a much smaller focus. When we do that, it seems that we create our own spiritual islands, if you will. Right? If it's just Father Jayme doing his own thing somewhere, or whichever priest, whichever bishop, whichever deacon doing his or her own thing, isolated from the rest, that person creates his or her own community, yes, maybe, but also his or her own reality. This is how I'm going to be a priest in this context. And each person makes that up based on their own experiences, their own formation, their own ideals. So I would say it would be fascinating to take a look around at all these independent Catholic communities. Show me how you celebrate Mass, and I can tell you who you are. Because what we do and what we say and how we choose to celebrate as a church, that's symbolic, right? If you choose to exclude women from ministry, I can tell you something about who you are, or what church you're trying to be. If you welcome all people, I can tell you something about who you are, or who you're trying to be. Show me your community, and I'll tell you who you are. What do we say in English? Birds of a feather flock together, right? It seems that people who come to Holy Family are drawn to the people at Holy Family. Let's say if you came to Holy Family and didn't have such a good experience that person, didn't quite fit with the people, you'd probably keep looking for another spiritual home. Birds of a feather flock together. Show me who you celebrate Mass with, and I'll tell you who you are. Seems it would be a fascinating study in sociology and or psychology for us to take a look at this independent Catholic movement of these different communities and how it is that they differ from one another. The image that comes to mind, have you ever heard the expression, the Grand Poobah? The Grand Poobah is an expression that comes from the Flintstones and from Happy Days. So if you Google Grand Poobah, you'll find images of Fred Flintstone and Barty Flintstone dressed in their high hat, their high furry hats. They're part of a secret society called the Loyal Order of Water Buffaloes. They dress a certain way with their hats and sashes and medals. They do certain things. It's essentially a spoof on all these other secret societies and men's fraternities, like the Shriners and the Freemasons and the Elks and the Moose and the Knights of Columbus. Okay? Isn't it true, though, instead of us looking at them and laughing, isn't it true that we're sort of like different communities take on different elements that cause us to reflect on what's happening here? So the Grand Poobah, with Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble, the Grand Poobah is the head of their secret society of the Loyal Order of Water Buffaloes. Do you know where the word Poobah comes from? This is a fascinating history. The word Poobah comes from Gilbert and Sullivan's comic opera, The Mikado. In 1885, comic opera called Mikado. It's a satire, and the way that he made fun of the British was by doing it through the Japanese. So he did a play set in the Japanese culture in order to be able to make fun of the British. And he was especially making fun of the British and how they like to get all dressed up. You know, when you think of the British in Parliament, you think of the wigs and of the period costume, and you think of the titles and the way that they speak. So Poobah comes from the Mikado, and there's a character in that called Poobah. P-O-O-B-A-H. Poobah. And if you start dissecting this play, it becomes a fascinating satire. Because Poobah is the Lord High Everything Else. His title, he made up titles for himself, and the chief title is Lord High Everything Else. Think of it in the church here. So we have deacons and priests and bishops and archbishops. The title he created for himself was, yeah, that's all nice. I am Lord High Everything Else. His other titles included First Lord of the Treasury, Lord Chief Justice, Commander-in-Chief, Lord High Admiral, Archbishop, and Lord Mayor. He gave himself all these titles. Think about this for a moment, especially the title. He gave himself the title of Archbishop, and I couldn't make this up, of Titipoo. The Mikado, 1885. Gilbert and Sullivan. The Archbishop, he gave himself this title. One of the dangers that we have in independent Catholicism is the way that we, are the things that we, is the identity that we create for ourselves, including titles. Within independent Catholicism, you will find all sorts of titles, not just including deacon, priest, bishop, and archbishop, but patriarch and primate, and yes, even pope, right? People making up names for themselves. So the word Poobah, and why that comes to mind, not only because of the high hats, which may remind us of other ecclesial objects, but it's simply because it's a mocking title for a person who believes him or herself to be self-important, who has an inflated a sense of self-regard, who has limited authority, but who has all these impressive titles, like Lord High Everything Else, like Archbishop of Titipoo, or whatever other titles they create for themselves. So this individualism within independent Catholicism creates this notion almost that I will call myself whatever I want. It almost sounds childish when I say it, but it's like, I'll call myself whatever I want. I will do whatever I want. I'll dress however I want. I'll celebrate the sacraments of the church and Mass however I want. It's sort of like this very individualistic way of thinking of church, rather than thinking about this larger vision of church. And I think one of the other challenges that we had for unity in the independent Catholic Church is simply ego, right? A lot of egos. Do you know where the word ego comes from? Ego is from the Latin ego, meaning I. Again, it goes back to individualism, right? It's about me and my ministry and my church, rather than about us and our ministry and our church. I think another challenge within independent Catholicism, if we were to set aside the individualism, which I think could be entire conversations of its own, another challenge that we have is not knowing who we are or where we come from. You know, not having a sense of our identity. We talked yesterday about some priests who call themselves Old Catholic, whereas Old Catholics will get them and say, you are not Old Catholic. You may be independent Catholic, but you're not Old Catholic. You're not associated with the Netherlands and the Archbishop of Utrecht, you're not old Catholic, right? A challenge of identity, a challenge of knowing our history, because our history is largely unwritten, right? We don't have persons who are sitting down and writing our history. We're a working clergy, often people with families. We don't have the same luxury of being able to sit down and write books that are hundreds of pages long on who we are and where we came from. Knowing the rich history of our movement and of the church, because there are different parts that we could reclaim, like the ordination of women. We've talked about that before. Women were part of the ordained ministry of the church through 529 AD. That's a quarter of our history where women were involved in the church, and yet what happens in far too many places? We erase that history. We tuck that history away and we hide it. For a quarter of our history, for more than a quarter of our history as a church, women were an integral part of our ministries. Wouldn't that be something for us to be able to reclaim that? Semi-Pelagianism, another way in which we could help to reclaim history is simply going back to the ancient church. Before we had notions that we could earn our own salvation, Pelagianism we called it, or that we cooperated with God to still earn our own salvation, that we need to, for instance, earn the sacraments of the church. That's the Semi-Pelagian heresy, which was condemned at the same council where women were excluded from ministry. Imagine if we were to help the church to go back to its roots of saying, confirmation classes, if you want to have 2 years of classes for young people in your church, go ahead and do it. But don't make that a requirement, because that's suddenly a heresy that was condemned in 529 AD. Another challenge that we have is simply being able to tell our story. It just struck me, Father Libardo was reading this work on the church that Constantine created. Imagine for a moment that our history could be reclaiming the church prior to Constantine. This church was just composed of all sorts of communities that believed all sorts of different things and were organized in different ways before they were brought together under this empire of Constantine. The empire of Constantine is what the Roman Catholic Church is today, this symbol of unity. We are this ancient expression of house churches which grew into larger communities and which aren't necessarily connected to one another. That's the ancient church. We can't trace the Pope all the way back to Peter, right? Another challenge we have in the independent Catholic circle is simply not knowing one another, right? Not knowing, even arriving at numbers. Archbishop and I were at lunch today just trying to estimate, how many people would we even estimate are part of this movement? Do we even know? Can we figure this out? And knowing them is one thing, but can we recommend them to others, right? It's one thing to be able to say that so far we've been able to identify 694 independent Catholic clergy in the United States. But when someone is traveling from Holy Family to another place, could we recommend that they look them up and that they celebrate with them? Maybe in some cases, right? Maybe with Father Lawman in Louisville, hey, if you're in Louisville, yeah, check them out. And hey, come back and tell us what it was like. But others, it just seems that it wouldn't necessarily be wise for us to be recommending other persons whom we don't know, simply because they're part of the same circle. Another challenge that we have is that we don't have churches, physical churches. And I raise that as a weakness for us, simply because when people think church, what do they think about? They don't think house churches, they think the building. Which is why when they went to Holy Family in its previous existence at a warehouse, they would arrive at the warehouse and ask, where's the church? Is this the church? Because when we think church, we're programmed to think the building. Within independent Catholicism, how many of us have buildings? For many, it's something that we do. Holy Family began in a living room. And that's typically how it begins in independent Catholicism, until the community outgrows that living room and needs to find another space. When people think about the spaces for churches, they don't think the ancient church and the house church model. They usually think a building with a steeple and a cross. Many people, so many people find this home church model foreign. It's just something that we need to think about in terms of, here at Holy Family, we're blessed with the church. In other places, like our missions here at Holy Family, our missions don't operate out of churches yet. They're really that home church model. And wouldn't it be something to help them to grow to other stages of their growth there? Another weakness that we have in independent Catholicism, because we are often working clergy with family and other obligations, trying to do ministry when we can, what that means for us is that we're often so focused on today that we're not thinking about tomorrow. Think about the problem there. What about legacy, right? If I'm just so focused on me and my community and my ministry here in Austin, what's going to happen? I'm going to be like so many other independent Catholic communities that have bubbled up and that have dissolved. What can we do to ensure our legacy, to ensure that independent Catholicism lives on after us? After all of us in this room are gone, what can we do to ensure that even after all of us in this room are gone, independent Catholicism keeps going strong? And the final weakness is simply related. Some of you may or may not know that one of the things I enjoy doing in my free time is that I'm a Wikipedian, meaning I contribute to Wikipedia articles. If you're reading about Dominique Marie Varlet, this bishop, Roman Catholic bishop who consecrated others, you're largely reading what I've written on Wikipedia. Right? I work on Wikipedia articles on bishops of the old Catholic Church, on various topics in the independent Catholic Church, simply be able to get things out there. And the last point about one of the weaknesses is simply coming from that experience. Because when I put up different articles on Wikipedia, the editors, which are people like myself who just come together into groups and who try to ensure some quality on Wikipedia, they will tell me that the things I'm writing about are not notable. They don't meet the notability standards for Wikipedia. They're not significant enough to be on Wikipedia. What makes something significant enough so that we can be thinking about, well, what would it take for something to be significant enough for that? It says, an organization is generally considered notable if it has been the subject of significant coverage in reliable, independent, secondary sources. Meaning, if Father Jayme is writing about his church, himself or his church on Wikipedia, that's not reliable. Wikipedia is about other people, right, giving their perspectives on a person like Father Jayme, and or a church like Holy Family, and or a large organization like the American Catholic Church in the United States, and or independent Catholicism. It's various persons who are offering other perspectives. So it's not primary sources, it's not Father Jayme, it's secondary sources, like Robin Ross, or the Austin Chronicle, or others who are showing that there's something here, there's something worth covering, that there's something notable. I just want to press the pause button there and see if there are any thoughts that come to mind as we hear some of these weaknesses, and or if there are other weaknesses that you can think of, and or any thoughts on weaknesses before we go on to strengths. Father?
Father, do you think that the reason they want to go to a church is because we've gone from that period where all the churches had their beginning at a house, and now all they see is buildings. We've gotten to that point, and we're starting over with an independent Catholic Church, and I don't know if they can relate to the way that things started in the Roman Church as compared to what we're having to go through. And they expect the building the very first time they come to church, right? So
it's almost like what we see is it's almost like we imagine that that's how it's always been.
yeah.
Oh, there's just always been churches, right? Or pope. There's always been a pope, right? There have always been bishops and priests. It's sort of like we don't have a sense of our history, but we are in the driver's seat here where we can help to reclaim that history. Imagine that for a moment. If we were to help people to know that what we're doing in our mission in Lockhart is what they did in the ancient church. In the ancient church, they didn't go to churches. They gathered in people's homes and broke open the Word and broke bread and shared a cup of wine together. That's what we're doing in Lockhart, and that's what the ancient church did. In the ancient church, Jesus excluded no one. That's what we're doing in Lockhart and in Holy Family. Deacon?
So I perceive that you can consider it a weakness statistically, being the outliers, which is where we're at, because in this day and time, everyone is used to going to a church building and having a system and having their needs met that way, their spiritual needs. That's what we have, as a community, grown to accept. At the same time, those outliers are exactly very much a strength. The fact that we are in that stage, because we can in fact create or recreate what it was from the beginning, or even pre-Constantine, and choose to go forward, even though it's somewhat of an uphill struggle to change the perspective of people about spirituality and what we believe in, our faith. That doesn't necessarily touch the building or the rules or a system. But to be able, to me, the biggest concern is going to be, how do we meet the needs of the people? Maybe even the needs that they can't even understand, because it's so much easier when you have a system. Oh, here's the problem, here's the answer. Bye. We don't have that kind of mentality. Okay, if you say these number of prayers, your sins are gone. Therefore, that's all you need. Okay, bye. So it can be a weakness, being way out there in the outlier position. And it can also be a strength.
We'll get to that in a moment. So we've just been talking weaknesses so far, but let's think about each of these, for instance. What if we were to take a look at each of these weaknesses and see how we could recast them so that it's essentially a strength? Think of it for a moment. The house church model that we have in Lockhart and in San Marcos, that is the church of your ancestors. The Roman Catholic Church is not the church. That's the church of your more recent ancestors. The house church, that was the church that predated them. What pride there should be of anyone who's part of a house church, but at the same time we've been so programmed to think, oh, going to church means going to that building. Archbishop?
You didn't say it specifically, but I think one weakness that should be addressed by name is legitimacy. Legitimacy. And what do I mean by that? We talked about that back in October, where there are some independent groups who claim they have apostolic succession, but when you dig deeper, it's not either documented or it's really sketchy. Which then gives that armor to our counterparts from the Roman tradition to say, there's a lot of independents who really don't know what they're doing because they aren't legitimate. They don't have true apostolic succession, so thus they are not Catholic. That's just one weakness that has to be overcome, because when you do your research, you'll find that, yeah, all these little outliers, one here, one there, where's their traceability to what bishop did who to what?
It seems it would be important for us, if we would ever align ourselves with anyone within the independent Catholic tradition, it seems it would be important for us to ask those questions. Apostolic succession, questions of legitimacy with respect to sacraments. Can we push on towards strengths in the time that we have? Strengths. So one strength that I see, Reverend Kathleen, on weaknesses?
Well, on weaknesses, you know, I'm from El Paso, you all know that. And besides myself, I do principally teaching ministry and hospital ministry. And there are some other independent Catholic churches that are there, and there's about 3 bishops, one of whom doesn't have much of an education, but somehow he got ordained. And they only do Pentecost. They just forget the rest of the liturgical year, just Pentecost, period. And then there's another bishop who, you know, just kind of I just scratched my head, how did he possibly get ordained? And when people see those individuals, it's hard to, I hate to use the word sell, but it's hard to really demonstrate the true image of an independent Catholic church when you have a lot of these negative forces. What I like to do is put together a very professional looking view of maybe independent, because you're doing this already, but maybe where you would not touch a certain area, others could, just to help complement your work. You know, teamwork above all.
Isn't it true though? What she's saying is absolutely true, right? The actions and the words of one person affect the rest of us, right? When one independent Catholic priest or bishop or deacon in whatever part of the world says something, when that person comes into contact with us, they bring that experience with them. Oh yeah, I knew an independent Catholic bishop once in El Paso. Thanks. Strengths. So I think here at Holy Family, we see the beauty and we see some of the strengths on a regular basis. I'm thinking, for instance, of, when on the one hand, I ask how significant we are in terms of Wikipedia standards, but when you come to Mass on Sunday at Holy Family, there's no doubt that we are significant, especially in the lives of the people we touch. When we hear the testimonies of people like Buck a few weeks ago, and of Gilbert and Pauline a few weeks before then, when we hear these stories of how we're significantly impacting lives in a way that people have not been touched in the past than their previous experiences of the church, I think that is a real strength of independent Catholicism. How it is that people here at this church, people who otherwise may not be coming to church, are coming to church and are receiving the sacraments and are finding a community and are finding God. How cool is that? People who've had whatever previous experiences of church feel at home and have that experience of community and of God and of the church here. Another strength that within a community like this, we have